This is Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell, all talk and all crime. We're going inside the Netflix binge-watched hit, Making a Murderer, Justice for Those Without Resources, Coerced Confessions, Allegations of Planted Evidence, The Illusion of Justice with Stephen Avery's lawyer. Today on Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. Jerry Buting was Steve Avery's lawyer along with Dean Strang during the Making a Murderer series on Netflix. He's a partner in Buting, Williams, and Stilling in Wisconsin. And the Stilling's his wife, who comes off as a saint, by the way, in the book. And the new book he's got out is The Illusion of Justice Inside Making a Murderer and America's Broken System. Making a Murderer was a 10-part Netflix series filmed over a 10-year period following the Stephen Avery case, from false imprisonment for 18 years for rape he didn't commit to conviction for a murder that's generated a lot of controversy. Welcome. Good to have you back, Jerry.
Thanks for having me. Good to be back.
Now, I had just learned, and the timing all fits, there's a second season of Making a Murderer upcoming?
There is. Netflix has been pretty closed-mouthed about when it's coming out and what it will cover, so I don't really know any of the details. I think the latest I heard was that they intend to release at least some of it before the end of this year.
Are you and Dean in it in any way?
I really don't know. That's going to be up to the producers, and we had no editorial control the first time, and we have none this time either.
Interesting. I will say that the O.J. case was the first case where we got to see how justice works in an ugly way on TV, and in that case with a dream team of nothing but resources to throw at it. And this was the first case where we saw what lower income folks have to deal with. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, in fact, that's one of the reasons. I'd say that was a big reason why we agreed to participate in the documentary. We were leery at first. I think no attorney really wants to give up control of anything, particularly your own case. Yeah. And we knew that we would have no control over the documentary, how it would come out, what they would focus on, and how we would look. But there had only really been one other documentary that kind of went behind the scenes, in real time while the case was developing, pre-trial and trial, from the defense perspective. And that was a case, it's a documentary called The Staircase. It was a case out of North Carolina, interestingly enough, with one of my former clinical professors at law school, who was leading the defense team. And that particular defendant was a novelist, pretty well-heeled. They had a lot of resources. I don't know if it was as much as with the O.J. case, but, not typical of the kinds of cases that we see in our criminal justice system. 80 to 85% of cases nationwide are charged against people who are too poor to afford a criminal lawyer to defend them, much less any experts or investigators. And so we thought this case would be more typical of the kinds of prosecutions that you see in our system of justice. It ended up having some interesting twists that were certainly not anticipated when we agreed to take the case, but so we thought it would be a good public education opportunity. We had no idea that it was going to be so successfully distributed worldwide and would generate this kind of interest.
And Stephen Avery, the innocence after 18 years in prison for a rape he could not have committed, and which DNA verified. How did you? How do you come to? What sense do you have of him as a man? How did he manage that anger that had to be there?
Well, you talk to exonerees who spend years or decades in prison, and everybody handles it a little bit differently. By and large, though, it's not unusual for people not to have the kind of bitterness that you might think. There's this relief and joy at being granted freedom again, rather than hatred and anger and bitterness. Although it's not uncommon for them to want to be compensated for something that large portions of their lives that were taken away from them that they can never regain. But that's certainly the way that Stephen Avery appeared to the public when he was released. That's the way he always appeared to me. Grateful to be, have been granted another chance at life, out in the world, free, but certainly determined to get to the bottom of what happened in his first conviction, and that's why the federal court lawsuit was filed, and all the depositions were progressing. I think there was somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 depositions that had been done before he got charged with the Halbach homicide.
You obviously have a good sense of this. The family is of lower income, and that ugly term "white trash" associated with them. Did you get a sense that they were treated that way?
Well, I do think that they were sort of on the outs in that society. They, in part because they worked in an auto salvage yard. Their hands were always grubby. It's not the kind of occupation that most small towns really appreciate, even though it's a very useful service because people need parts for their old cars, and it was pretty successful. I mean, people were out there all the time. They had the place well organized, and you come in saying, "I need a part for a 1991 Buick," and they'll get it for you. But I did get the sense that they were not, and you really see that in the first wrongful conviction, by the way, from 1985, when Stephen Avery brought 16 alibi witnesses to the trial, and some documentation in the form of sales receipts showing that he was 45 minutes away or an hour away at approximately the time the supposed rape was occurring in Manitowoc. And despite all of that, he was up against a victim in the case who was very believable, but also from a prominent family in the Manitowoc area. So it, I think, was very, very indicative of the fact that his witnesses were all discounted, and she was given the most weight, and even though her identification of him proved to have been false.
All right, we're going to get into now some of these illusion of justice issues. The first one I want to talk about is coerced confessions, because people have a hard time believing this, but I've had a chance to interview one of the Central Park Five, Rafael Solicito, who was Amanda Knox's boyfriend, and I've spoken with Amanda Knox, all of whom were victims of coerced confessions. I'd like you to talk about that, and obviously this is in the context of Brendan Dassey, who is the nephew of Stephen Avery.
People do have a hard time believing that people falsely confess, and that's why it's so powerful in a jury trial when the state presents evidence that someone confessed. Most people would think, hey, if I'm accused of something that I didn't do, there's no way I'm going to admit to that. But we do know that, in the 300 to 400 cases of DNA exonerations from the Innocence Project, people are going back and studying those. And in approximately 25% of the time, those defendants confessed, even though DNA proved they were not guilty. So social scientists and psychologists started exploring, well, what is it about the police interrogation techniques that are used, and why do people falsely confess? And it really is sort of a combination of two factors. One, it's a vulnerability, a suggestibility that some people have, whether because of their youth, inexperience, possible mental limitations. So vulnerable juveniles or adults who are then placed into a situation where they are interrogated by very skilled detectives who use a particular technique that has been shown to be successful in getting guilty people to confess, but also sweeps into the net a disturbing number of innocent people who falsely confess. And that's known as the Reed technique, developed back in the 1950s, which in its time was actually an advance because about 10 or 20 years before that, the United States Supreme Court had said, finally, that we cannot use in court any confessions that are beaten out of people physically, with physical coercion. And so this gentleman, John Reed, came up with psychological questioning techniques that would take the place of that to try and get people to confess. The problem is it's based on science, behavioral science, that's since been largely debunked in study after study, and yet American law enforcement has continued to use these techniques. By the way, the rest of the English-speaking world has abandoned them in the last 15, 20 years. They use a less confrontational technique known as PEACE, P-E-A-C-E, that's been shown to be less likely to get people to falsely confess, and yet is also equally good at getting the really guilty people to confess, or at least jurors to be able to see them, what they say, and use that against them if in fact they're guilty. So, one of the problems with the Reed technique is that it assumes that police officers are like human lie detectors, that they're somehow able in a pre-interview, maybe 15, 20 minutes, to judge whether or not their suspect is lying. And, in fact, studies have shown police are no better at, discerning lies than the majority of people. They're human beings, and we can't always detect that correctly. We miss. So they look at body language, and is the suspect slumping in his chair as he's talking to you? Well, if you've ever had a teenager as a parent, what teenager doesn't slump? Or doesn't make eye contact? The kinds of things that they think they're able to use to determine whether a suspect is telling the truth or lying. And that's important because once they make their mind up that the suspect is lying, then it becomes this interrogation process. And they are allowed to lie to the suspect, claim that they have evidence that doesn't exist. They are instructed to not accept any denials from the defendant, no matter how many times. They use minimization techniques, and, like in a sexual assault case, the babysitter, well, she was a pretty attractive young lady. I can see you had maybe a little something to drink. You came home. I'd be sort of interested in coming on to her too. You're not such a bad guy, and get people to start accepting their theory about what happened, and a number of other things that really lead people into falsely confessing. And you see this technique played out beautifully in the Brendan Dassey interrogation. One of the interesting ironies of this case is that until 6 months before Brendan Dassey's confession, we did not require police to record interrogations of suspects in custody. The law had been changed just 6 months earlier. Before that, what happened, and what still happens in about half of the states where they don't require recordings of interrogations, the detectives would come into court and they would say, the suspect confessed to us, and this is what he said, and this is how he said it, and it would be a defendant's version, no, I didn't say that, or they tricked me, or they promised me, or whatever. It would be their word against the police, and the police almost always would win under those circumstances. Now, when you actually have a recording, you've got the best evidence to a judge or a jury about what really went on in that interrogation, what was said by the police, what was said by the suspect, how it was said, and that's what I think really shocked people the most out of this Making a Murderer series, is when they got to see in a real case how these techniques are applied to someone of Brendan Dassey's youth and mental limitations, to the point where after they've led him into this admission of this horrible rape, murder, disfigurement and of the body and burning of the body. He says, well, are we about done? I've got a project due in 6th period class. Can I go back to school? It just doesn't.
It doesn't hold. And they basically lied to him to get him to give these facts, and he had no lawyer present. And it really comes across, and the kid comes across as completely mentally, limited too. So it's an interesting thing. We'll get back now to this. I want to talk about another case, the Ralph Armstrong case that you were involved in. Give us the overview on that.
Sure, but the book Illusion of Justice is not just about the Stephen Avery case. It's probably only about a third about that. What I do is I try and explain with other cases I've had in my career how some of these same flaws that you see in our justice system portrayed in Making a Murderer are unfortunately rather common in the criminal justice system. And the Ralph Armstrong case is one example. It's in there in part because it's, after the documentary came out, people asked me, well, boy, that Stephen Avery case, that must have really been the craziest case you've ever had, right? Mm-hmm. And I said, well, not really. I mean, yeah, it was pretty wild, but here's another one. And the Ralph Armstrong case was going on at the same time. Ralph was convicted and ultimately spent 29 years in prison before I got him released of a heinous rape murder that happened in Madison back in 1980. I got on the case volunteering to work for the Innocence Project in New York with Barry Shack. What I didn't realize is that I would be on the case for 15 years before we finally got it dismissed. And for all of those 15 years, there was at least one or two pieces of evidence where DNA testing had already been done and had already excluded Ralph Armstrong from the crime scene evidence. And yet the state continued to fight us all the way up till the end. And that we see, unfortunately, very commonly across the country, where evidence that's presented to a jury that is claimed to be, from the killer. In Ralph's case, there were two head hairs that were found on a bathrobe belt that was laying across the victim's body. Clearly, she had been strangled, and so that was the presumed murder weapon. And at trial, they told the jury those two head hairs were Ralph Armstrong's. In fact, they were not. DNA proved they were not. And suddenly, once we did that, the state was like, well, those hairs didn't really come from the killer. They could have been, deposited innocently. That doesn't prove he's innocent. And so we ended up doing test after test. We, at one point, finally got we had to go all the way to the Wisconsin Supreme Court to get his conviction reversed and sent back for either dismissal or a new trial. The prosecution then went through a number of additional tests. Eventually, 60 pieces of evidence were tested with DNA that proved not to have come from Ralph Armstrong, and still they wouldn't dismiss the case. Still they were intent on trying it.
Isn't it true also that we're down to 2 minutes for this segment, that there was exculpatory evidence on Avery's rape charge long before the 18 years ended up?
That's true. In fact, his case went all the way to the Court of Appeals in 1995 or 6, I believe, and he had been excluded from DNA that was found under the fingernails of the rape victim. And the state fought him on that, and the state argued that it wasn't conclusive enough evidence. It could have been, DNA from perhaps the paramedics when she was being treated, even though there was no evidence that she was scratching the paramedics. So, that was another example. And in fact, in the Ralph Armstrong case, they used that Court of Appeals decision from Stephen Avery's 1990 case against him to try and prevent him from getting a new trial. Ultimately, the Wisconsin Supreme Court reversed the Stephen Avery decision, the Court of Appeals decision, but it was after Stephen had already been released, so it didn't actually help him directly. So I do talk about what happens in the Ralph Armstrong case. I won't spoil it for possible readers, but it's a pretty shocking development that occurs based in part on a tip I received during the trial of Stephen Avery that blew the case wide open and ultimately showed shocking prosecutorial misconduct and destruction of exculpatory evidence.
Yeah, you've been amazed in some amazing cases with sudden ups and downs. You're listening to Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell from our flagship station, WGCH Greenwich. Coming next, we'll look into Stephen Avery's innocence or guilt. And we're back with Jerry Buting. He's the author of Illusion of Justice, Inside Making a Murderer in America's Broken System. I just want to start off this one to let folks know that tell us about Brendan Dassey's conviction has been overturned. Is that correct? But he's not been let out of jail.
That's correct. A federal judge ruled that his confession was coerced and involuntary and ordered the confession thrown out, the conviction reversed, and the state then, though, decided to appeal that decision to the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, 7th Circuit, which is based in Chicago. And frankly, a decision on that could come any day now. It's been fully briefed, and oral argument was on Valentine's Day. So it's around the time when it wouldn't surprise me if a decision was coming out one way or the other.
Let me ask you, let's assume that Brendan Dassey was guilty, was involved to some degree. Do you think because of the coercive nature of that confession, the fact that his own attorney was working against him would justify the conviction being thrown out regardless of innocence or guilt?
Well, that's a decision that ultimately the federal judge didn't reach. He did conclude that the attorney's representation was indefensible. Brendan was, even though he was charged, he was and already represented by his attorney. At one point, you see this in the documentary when his attorney hires a private investigator who coerces him even more than the police did. I was shocked when I saw that video of his private investigator interviewing him in the jail. I'd never seen that before the documentary came out.
That was almost worse than the cops' interrogation of him.
Yeah, I mean, Brendan is, okay, you've written this out. Is Teresa in this statement? No. Well, then it's not true. I can't help you. You've got to put it in, and draw that picture bigger so the jury can see it. And, just walking him through, shocking what he was doing. And then to offer Brendan Dassey up to the police for another interview the following morning without his attorney present because his lawyer said, well, I got to be in Army Reserve training on Saturday morning. You can go ahead and do it without me. That's shocking, abandonment of a client. And ultimately, that was why he was removed from the case before it went to trial.
And interestingly, the book reveals that you could have, at one point, been Brendan's attorney, right?
Well, there's that possibility. I don't know. It just so happened that I was, Dean was hired about 3.5 months into the case, having been charged, Stephen Avery case, and then I was contacted by Dean and was meeting with him about 10 days, 2 weeks later, in his office, trying to decide if I would agree to take the case and how we would divide up responsibilities. And so we've been talking about an hour when the phone rings, and it's a member of the family saying, Brendan's been arrested. And they say he's confessed. And, we looked at each other and we said, well, rather than coming in to help Stephen Avery, maybe you should go represent Brendan. But unfortunately, at that point, there was a legal conflict of interest because we'd already been talking about Stephen's case long enough. But I've often thought, if that call came in an hour earlier, who knows, maybe I would have been representing Brendan.
Interestingly, and let's say that, this issue of the resources available to a poor case, you and Dean, you could be viewed as a dream team because of your talents, but you guys didn't make a ton of money, right?
We didn't. I mean, it may seem like a lot to members of the public, but, we knew when we got the case that the amount of time we would spend would, outstrip whatever money we had. In fact, I was keeping my time until about, September, and on an hourly basis, the money was all gone. I think Dean figured out later we maybe made about $9 an hour. We're not whining and complaining about that. We knew that it wasn't going to be, something we were going to get wealthy off of, but we knew it's the kind of case that, it's a professional challenge that a good criminal defense attorney shouldn't shy away from. So we did our best with the resources we had, but we could never match, the kinds of resources the state threw into that trial, including, being able to get the FBI to stop everything and, create a whole new test for EDTA as preservative to try and refute our our evidence of possible tampering with this blood vial. And, that had never been done before. There's no way that the defense could have marshaled those kinds of resources. There were no labs anywhere, private labs, that would do that kind of test. And we tried to find one, but nobody could do it. Yet the state managed to get the FBI involved, even though it wasn't even a case in their jurisdiction. It was a state crime, not a federal one.
All right, let's jump into some of the signs of whether he may or may not have been guilty, which obviously is hanging in the public eye still. And I'm going to start with the blood because planting of evidence was a central part of the doubt that you guys tried to raise, obviously to get to reasonable doubt. And I gather that actually there were 6 instances of Avery's blood found, and they were varied. One was from a cut that he apparently had on a finger, which I didn't know about. So that would have been just dripping. And then others were where he reached, like, for instance, if he turned the car ignition on in her car to move it, where it was more of a sweeping motion. And EDTA, which would have been a preservative that would have shown that it could have come from that vial in 1995, is ruled out essentially, right, because of the EDTA. Is it? How do you basically explain the blood being in her car?
Okay, well, you have to start with the fact that there was none of Teresa Halbach's blood or DNA, not a speck of it, found anywhere inside Stephen's
that's right,
trailer or garage, and yet, according to the story they got Brendan Dassey to say, there was this bloody murder, stabbing in the stomach, slitting of the throat, that she was shackled to the bedpost. There was no evidence of that. There were no scratches. They looked microscopically on the wood bedposts and ripped up the carpet, took out the paneling, found no hair, no blood, no nothing. The only place that they found his blood in an incriminating location was in 6 spots inside of her RAV4. Mm-hmm. And long before we were on the case, before he was even in custody, in fact, the media interviewed him, and he said, my blood is not in her vehicle. If it's in there, they must have planted it. This is like 20 years ago. They're trying to get back at me because I've got this lawsuit pending. And they scoffed and said, we don't have access to his blood. How could we even have done that? That's what Special Prosecutor Ken Kratz said on TV. Well, it turns out we discovered that there was this blood vial taken in 1996 when Stephen Avery was still in prison on the wrongful rape conviction. And it was sitting in an unsecured file in the clerk's office, and there was evidence that the evidence tape that sealed the styrofoam kit had been slit open, and there was no seal around the stopper of the vial, and therefore it was available and accessible to the police, or to the sheriffs, I should say, Manitowoc sheriffs, if they wished to do that. Now, what they argued was, despite what they had claimed, they did in fact have access and the ability to have planted his blood, because there was a source of his blood right across the atrium in the very same building, the old courthouse in Manitowoc. And so instead they tried to go at it indirectly, and they created this EDTA test that was not validated scientifically by anybody. It was not even used by the FBI until it was created while the trial was going on. And they tested only 3 of the 6 locations in which his blood was found in her vehicle. Mm-hmm. And they concluded that we didn't detect EDTA, which is a chemical preservative in blood to keep it from coagulating, because we didn't detect it in the stains found inside the RAV4. Therefore, it couldn't have come from the blood in the vial. It must have come from an actively bleeding Stephen Avery. And then they also said, even the 3 stains we never even tested, we conclude to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty could not have come from the blood vial. It must have come from an actively bleeding Stephen Avery. Well, by the time that came out, we had no chance to refute it with an actual test of our own. But we did present an analytical chemist who said, look, you have to, first of all, you have to test every stain. You can't start guessing at what is or isn't in a stain. And secondly, this test was designed in a way that we don't know how sensitive it was, to be able to pick up EDTA if it's there or not. Since the documentary came out, we've been contacted. Before he retained his new attorney, Kathleen Zellner, we were contacted by scientists from all over the world, really, who said, look, science has improved in the last 10 years. There might be some tests that can be done that can answer this question. So we'll see.
All right, let me ask you about other evidence that on the surface could look incriminating, that Teresa Halbach's DNA was found on the bullet, and the bullet was linked to the rifle that was above Avery's bed. And in a thing that implicates Brendan and also adds DNA evidence, is he's the one that led them to the car hood was opened and that Avery touched the hatch where they found bloodless DNA from sweat, which obviously could not have been planted. Well, what do you say about those things?
Okay, well, actually, when you look at the transcript, he said nothing about the hood or going under the hood. That was fed to him by Detective Fassbender from the DCI.
Would they have had a basis to ask why it was opened?
Yes, because they knew the battery cables had been disconnected, and so there was some reason to think that somebody had gone under the hood. And so they led him into saying that. Well, did he do anything else? And did he do anything else with the car? And at first Brendan says, well, he put the knife under the seat. Well, what knife under the seat? There never was a knife under the seat. There's no evidence of that. And so they kept pushing him. Anything else? I mean, did he do anything else? Like, did he go under the hood or something? Well, yeah. Did you see him doing anything under the hood? No, I couldn't see, but he was had gone under the hood. That's the way this whole way his confession went. And secondly, it was never proven that this was bloodless DNA that was found on the latch to the hood. The only way you can tell where DNA comes from is if you use a presumptive test. And so there's a presumptive test to see if it's blood, and then they usually, if they find that something's blood, then they go on and do DNA. In this case, the quantity of DNA that they found was so small that they skipped the presumptive test altogether and went right to the DNA. And the state's own experts kind of refuted the argument at trial that this was very incriminating evidence against Stephen Avery, because one of their technicians said that he had been inside the RAV4 sampling and looking at these blood stains and whatnot, and he had gloves on. And then somebody asked him to get the odometer reading. Well, he turned a key that they got to fit it, and the battery was dead. You couldn't see the odometer. It's just a mistake, a human mistake. He forgot to change his gloves before he opened the hood. And later the state's DNA expert said that this quantity of DNA that was found on there was very small, and yes, it would have been consistent with what we call innocent transfer that's now very well documented in DNA cases, where I could shake your hand, you could go off and rob a bank and leave the gun, and they find my DNA on the gun I never touched. All of that was presented to the jury, and it was really kind of a red herring on the state's case. Mr. Kratz, I think, spent about a half a page of his closing argument, hundreds of pages, even talking about that piece of evidence. It's only after the documentary came out that he started complaining that this was really powerful evidence for the state that was left out.
Let's talk motive for a sec, because it's hard to conceive that a guy that was on the verge of getting money that would have set him up for life would do something so crazy. In the prosecutor's book, he mentions some stuff that I didn't know, that he'd been accused because on the show, on the documentary, he comes across, as you said earlier, as an amazingly sort of low-key guy, given what he'd suffer, but that he had a history with women. He may have allegedly raped a babysitter, raped his 17-year-old niece, domestic violence with his first wife, including threatening to kill her, writing letters where he threatened to kill her, and with his girlfriend at the time, Jody Stokowski, that he threatened to kill her. And that the motive that he had was that he needed to get retribution for his imprisonment, that on October 10th in a bathrobe she'd showed up, and that when he invited her back to sell his sister's car, he took steps to make sure that she didn't know it was he that was getting her back on the property. Your thoughts on all of that?
Okay, well, there's a whole lot packed into that question, but let's start with actually what the story is. He's claimed that the prosecutor claims that on October 10th, that she came to his house to take pictures of a vehicle, and that he answered the door in just a towel. That was largely debunked in a pretrial hearing outside the presence of the jury. They tried to use that as evidence. They were trying to argue that Stephen lured her to the property and she didn't know where she was going, and he used his sister's name and all of that. In fact, she'd been to the property 5 or 6 times. She knew where she was going. This supposed bath towel incident came out when one of her colleagues said that, we were chatting somewhere around October 10th about weird things that had happened while we were working and taking pictures of people's cars and all over the place. And she said, well, I once had this overweight, middle-aged guy come to the door wearing a towel, and they laughed about it. It was like, ew, gross, and they were joking. She was joking. She never expressed any fear about coming out to Stephen Avery's or the Avery salvage yard at all before she disappeared to anybody. She clearly knew where she was going. He used his sister's name because he was calling the office to say, he wanted to put an ad in the paper for the sister's car. Well, that's whose name is on the title. That's who ultimately you'd have to, you'd be disclosing that information. That would be the sale. And, in fact, she knew where she was going. Mr. Kratz wants to sort of ignore that, but first of all, the address was on Avery Road. 2 hours before she went out there, she had a conversation with the auto trader saying, I'm on my way to the Avery brothers. She was not lured out there not knowing where she was going or never was.
Jerry, apparently, at least according to Ken, that she made a phone call in the afternoon, though, saying she needed directions and she needed to know who she was seeing. And that, of course, he's implying that she may have been trying to make sure it wasn't Stephen.
Yeah, that actually was in the morning. That was not...
Oh, okay.
That was in the morning when she first got just a message. She hadn't actually talked to Auto Trader. And so she called the phone number and she left a message. Then she actually did connect with the woman at the Auto Trader office, and they gave her the address, and then she fully understood where she was going. She said, I'm on our way to the Avery brothers.
All right, you're listening to Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. We've got our final segment coming up, and we're going to talk to Jerry about how we fix the illusion of justice. We're back with our final segment. Jerry Buting, Stephen Avery's lawyer, the Netflix hit series Making a Murderer, and finishing up on Stephen Avery. Do you feel that the allegations of abuse of women that were rather significant shows, Jerry, that he could have been the kind of person that could have done something so heinous?
No, I don't. And some of those allegations are overblown or just plain false. The allegation that he, for instance, beat his current girlfriend at the time, Jody Stokowski. There was one claim a year before he was arrested on the Avery case where the police came out and they never even arrested him. They saw that she was making this claim that he had choked her, and they did a report that she appeared intoxicated, that there was no marks on her throat, that her story didn't make sense, and ultimately she didn't press charges. Well, it's only after the fact now that they try and make that into this proven abuse case when in fact it wasn't. Yes, he did write threatening letters to his wife while he was in prison, wrongfully convicted, because she said she wasn't going to bring the children to come see him anymore. But, put yourself in his position where he knows he's wrongly convicted. He's been sent away forever. His children are growing up without him being able to see him. And, that information was in the documentary, those letters that he wrote.
Yes.
But people say things all the time. It doesn't mean that they're really going to act on them. And in fact, the judge agreed, and the judge never even let that part into the trial.
The rape allegations?
The rape allegations, again, were never proved. In fact, they were never even charged. Mr. Kratz wants to throw around allegations of unproven claims against people as if that means that they're really guilty, when he himself had allegations later come up after the Avery trial, in which 15 women came forward and accused him of various types of misconduct, vulnerable women that he was either prosecuting or in positions of vulnerability. And he likes to say that most of those were never even charged against him in a attorney disciplinary proceeding, but somehow, even though he was never charged with anything involving those, and therefore he's innocent, he's not willing to give Stephen Avery the same benefit of reasonable doubt on uncharged misconduct.
All right, well, let's finish up with what needs to be done. I mean, these public defenders only get $40 an hour, the coercive interrogations. What are you suggesting we reform to bring, to get rid of the illusion of justice and have real justice?
Well, I spend some time at the end of the book talking about that so that the people go away from this, from reading the book and not just despair that nothing can be done. There are some things that can be done by individuals, and then as a society. We need to, for one thing, when people get a jury summons, they need to stop looking at it like it's a root canal. It's the one opportunity we have as citizens to participate in the third branch of government, the judiciary. People should take it seriously. It's a civic responsibility. Come to court if you are, but be honest. Not every person is going to be the right juror on a particular case. If you've got something, a close loved one who may have been sexually assaulted, you may not be able to put aside the feelings from that case that you would need to in order to be fair in this case.
I think you raise a good point. We'll move through this quickly. On crime labs, whether they're infallible or not, and they go in, it's not blindly done, right? I mean, it's the prosecution generally going through this, so there might be a way to make it more objective?
Yeah, we need to make crime labs independent of law enforcement. They don't do real science, by and large, with the exception of DNA types of tests. More and more of the so-called forensic evidence that's been used against people has been debunked. I'll give you an example of a hair comparison testimony again, because that was used in the Ralph Armstrong case. That's the idea that you use a double-field microscope and you look at a hair that's found at the crime scene, and you compare it with a hair that's been plucked from the suspect's head. And, for decades they were using that, including the FBI. Well, just about 2 years ago, to their credit, the FBI admitted that they went back and looked at their own, 268 of their own cases where their agents had testified about hair comparison testimony, and they found that in 95% of those cases, their experts either misleadingly or simply incorrectly presented what their evidence had shown. 95% of the time, and those are supposedly the best and the brightest from the FBI lab. When you multiply that by tens of thousands all over the country, you see that there are people that are being convicted on evidence that just isn't reliable. And in fact, the FBI and most states have no longer use that evidence because DNA proved, as it did in the Ralph Armstrong case, that it's not reliable. Similar, the next domino that's about to fall is ballistics evidence, so-called tool mark evidence. The idea that you can look at a shell or a bullet and conclude that it came from a gun found at the crime scene or the defendant's gun, such as Stephen Avery, and say that it came from that gun and no other gun in the world. That's bogus. Test after test has shown that that's not the case. It may have been true 100 years ago when they bore, they did hand-bored rifle, and there would be these little marks that were unique to each rifle. Now they're mass-produced on assembly lines, and you don't see that kind of unique characteristics that you would have otherwise found. So some of it has to be the forensic science community as a whole has to tighten up their process and stop using as so-called science evidence in court that really isn't. And some of it also needs to be that you need to make the labs more independent so they're not trying to come up with a result that they're being told could help the the prosecution or the law enforcement case.
As we finish up, tell us what's next for Stephen Avery. Where is he in the appeals process? Does he have any opportunities left?
Well, he does. His direct appeal is over, so at this point his best approach would be to find newly discovered evidence, and that is what his new attorney, Kathleen Zellner, has been doing. She's been trying to employ newer types of scientific tests on various pieces of evidence from the crime scene or the RAV4 or whatever it might be. Those things take time, and in part it's because most of these tests were developed for other reasons besides forensics. So they were developed for a medical reason or research science, and you have to go through sort of other hoops in order to get that kind of evidence into court. And so I think she's trying to make sure that she dots all her I's and crosses the T's properly.
Well, this is a fast hour, and the book has a lot more in it, so you got to be sure and read it, and including a heart-rending story of life-threatening cancer that Jerry had, which really, I guess, shows you the resilience he had fighting back and then fighting for justice, defending the defenseless, if you will. I want to thank Jerry. The Illusion of Justice Inside Making a Murderer and America's Broken System. His website is buting, buting.com. Our next show, we've got Max Holland on the 100th anniversary of what would have been JFK's birthday. He's done a re-examination of the Zapruder film, talking about Jerry and ballistics evidence that he believes shows the first shot could have been fired earlier, allowing even more time for Oswald to have done it. Thanks to Jerry Buting for coming back on. See everybody next Monday, Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell.